The courtroom was already buzzing before the judge entered, a low hum of expectation that came from people who believed they were about to witness something predictable. Marcus Hale sat comfortably at the plaintiff's table, his tailored charcoal suit fitting him like armor. Everything about him suggested control. The polished shoes, the expensive watch catching the overhead lights, the relaxed way he leaned back in his chair. This was not his first legal battle, and in his mind, it would not be his first victory. To him, that the divorce was a formality, a final signature at the bottom of a chapter he had already closed. Across the aisle sat Emily Hale. She was alone except for her attorney, a quiet man flipping through notes he already knew by heart. Emily's dress was simple, navy blue, unremarkable by design. Her hair was pulled back neatly, her face calm, almost detached. To an outsider, she looked like someone already resigned to loss. Marcus noticed this and smiled to himself. He had always enjoyed moments like this, moments when he felt unquestionably superior. He leaned toward his lead lawyer and whispered, "Look at her. She finally understands how this ends." The lawyer smirked. "This will be quick," he replied. "She doesn't have the leverage to fight." Marcus glanced back at Emily, expecting to catch her eyes, to see fear or hesitation. She didn't look at him. Instead, she stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. The lack of reaction irritated him more than anger ever could. For years, Emily had responded to him, questioned him, tried to reason with him. Her silence now felt unnatural, and Marcus dismissed the discomfort by telling himself it was the silence of defeat. The judge entered and the room rose. When everyone sat again, Marcus's lawyer stood confidently to deliver the opening statement. He spoke of ambition and sacrifice, of a man who built his company from nothing while carrying the weight of responsibility alone. He framed Marcus as a visionary, a provider, someone whose success came from discipline and intellect. Emily, by contrast, was described as supportive but ultimately irrelevant to the empire Marcus had created. "My client," the lawyer said smoothly, "does not deny that Mrs. Hale was present during his journey. But presence is not ownership. Emotional support does not equal financial contribution." The words landed exactly as intended. Marcus nodded slightly, satisfied. When it was Emily's lawyer's turn, the contrast was clear. His voice lacked the same authority, his delivery cautious. He spoke about partnership, about unseen labor, about years spent managing a life that allowed Marcus to focus solely on growth. He argued that contribution took many forms. Marcus barely listened. In his mind, the case was already decided. A short recess was called. Marcus stood and deliberately walked toward Emily, stopping just close enough to assert dominance. "This doesn't have to get ugly," he said quietly. "Sign the settlement. Take what's offered. You won't get anything better." His tone was almost kind, which made it crueler. Emily finally looked up at him. Her gaze was steady. "You've always believed that," she said softly, "that what you see is all there is." Marcus laughed under his breath. "You always liked sounding mysterious," he replied. "It never changed reality." The judge called everyone back to order. As proceedings resumed, the heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened. The sound cut through the room with unexpected force. Heads turned. 3 people entered, their movements calm, purposeful. They did not rush, nor did they hesitate. The woman at the center carried herself with quiet authority, a leather briefcase in her hand. The judge frowned. "This court is in session," he said sharply. "State your business." The woman stepped forward. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "I am here on behalf of an interested party whose involvement has not been disclosed." A murmur spread through the room. Marcus felt a flicker of unease. His lawyer stiffened. "There are no undisclosed parties," he objected. The woman calmly handed documents to the clerk. "These filings suggest otherwise." As the judge reviewed the papers, the atmosphere shifted. Marcus's lawyer skimmed a copy, his confidence draining with each line. "This is impossible," he whispered. Marcus stood abruptly. "What is this?" he demanded. "Who are you?" Emily rose slowly from her seat. The movement drew every eye. She no longer looked small. "I am Emily Hale," she said evenly. and what you are seeing is the part of my life you never bothered to understand." She turned slightly toward the judge. "The assets in question were placed in my name years ago. The ownership structure is clear." Marcus stared at her, disbelief turning into panic. "You're lying," he said hoarsely. Emily met his gaze without emotion. "You thought my silence meant ignorance," she replied. "You thought my trust meant weakness. Today you learn the difference." The judge called for order, his expression now serious. Marcus sat back down slowly, the certainty he had carried into the courtroom dissolving. For the first time he realized the story he believed was ending had only just begun. The judge adjusted his glasses and leaned forward, studying the documents more carefully now. The confidence that had filled the room minutes earlier was gone, replaced by a sharp, uneasy silence. Marcus could hear his own breathing, shallow and uneven, as if the air itself had grown heavier. He glanced at his lawyer, expecting reassurance, a whispered explanation, anything. What he saw instead was hesitation. His lawyer's jaw was tight, eyes fixed on the pages in front of him, fingers gripping the paper a little too hard. "Mrs. Hale," the judge said slowly, "are you claiming majority ownership of the assets listed in this filing?" "Yes, Your Honor," Emily replied. Her voice was calm, steady, almost detached. It was the voice of someone stating facts, not making demands. Marcus shot to his feet again. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "She doesn't know anything about ownership structures or investments. She barely understands how my business works." The words spilled out of him automatically, the same dismissive language he had used for years. He didn't even realize he was repeating old habits. Emily turned toward him, not angrily, but with something far more unsettling, quiet certainty. "I understood enough to read every contract you signed," she said. "I understood enough to ask questions when you were too busy congratulating yourself." A ripple moved through the gallery. Marcus felt it, felt the shift of attention, of judgment, slowly turning against him. The woman who had entered earlier stepped forward again. "Your Honor," she said, "I represent the holding firm that manages Mrs. Hale's trusts. These trusts predate the marriage, and additional assets were transferred legally during it." She placed another folder on the bench. "Mr. Hale was notified of these structures at the time of signing." Marcus's head snapped toward her. "That's a lie," he said. "I would remember something like that." "She didn't." Blink. "You were notified," she replied evenly. "You chose not to read the documents." The words landed like a physical blow. Marcus felt heat rise to his face. For a moment he considered shouting, arguing harder, overpowering the room the way he always had. But something stopped him. The judge's expression, the stillness of Emily's posture, the absence of fear where he expected it most. Emily's lawyer stood again, emboldened now. "Your Honor, given this new information, we request a temporary suspension of proceedings and an immediate review of asset distribution." Marcus's lawyer stood quickly. "We object," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "This is highly irregular. My client has been ambushed." "Ambushed?" Emily repeated softly. She turned to Marcus fully now. "You called it strategy when you did it to others. Why does it feel different when it happens to you?" The judge raised a hand for silence. "Enough," he said. "This court will take a brief adjournment to review these filings." He struck the gavel once, firmly. As people stood, whispered conversations exploded throughout the room. Marcus remained frozen for a moment before sinking back into his chair. His lawyer leaned toward him, speaking in a low, urgent tone. "Marcus," he said, "we need to talk. If these documents hold, this changes everything." Marcus shook his head. "No," he muttered. "This can't be real. She's bluffing. She's trying to scare us." But even as he said it, doubt cray. PT in. He replayed memories he had long dismissed. Emily asking questions at dinner. Emily quietly attending meetings she didn't need to be at. Emily insisting on keeping copies of paperwork. He had laughed then. He wasn't laughing now. Emily stepped out into the hallway during the adjournment. The noise of the courtroom faded behind her, replaced by a quiet attention. The woman in the black suit joined her. "You handled that well," she said. Emily exhaled slowly. "I didn't plan to speak today," she admitted, "but I knew he would push." "He always does," the woman replied. People like him mistake restraint for weakness. Marcus watched from across the hall as Emily spoke confidently, no longer the small, silent figure he thought he knew. Something cold settled in his stomach. For the first time since filing for divorce, he felt truly uncertain. Not angry, not annoyed, afraid. When the judge returned, the room snapped back to order. After reviewing the submitted documentation, he said, "This court recognizes Mrs. Hale's claims as valid pending further verification." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Effective immediately, all disputed assets will be frozen." Marcus's lawyer whispered. "This is bad." Marcus barely heard him. The phrase echoed in his head. Assets frozen, control lost. Emily closed her eyes briefly, not in relief, but in resolve. This was only the beginning. She knew Marcus would not accept this quietly. Men like him never did. They fought harder, they started losing. As the session ended, Marcus tried to approach her, but the distance between them felt larger than the courtroom itself. Emily gathered her things and walked past him without slowing. He called her name, his voice tight. She didn't turn around. For years, Marcus had believed the story was about power he held and generosity he granted. Walking out of the courtroom that day, he began to understand that the story had never been his alone, and the chapter he feared most was just starting. Marcus left the courthouse with a storm raging behind his eyes. Cameras flashed outside, reporters shouting questions he refused to answer. He pushed past them, jaw clenched, phone already pressed to his ear. "Get me everyone," he snapped into the receiver. "Finance, legal, PR. I want answers, now." The confidence he once wore so easily had cracked, replaced by urgency that bordered on desperation. Inside his car, silence swallowed him. The city moved outside the tinted windows, indifferent to the fact that his world was tilting. He replayed the moment Emily stood up in court, the way her voice never shook. That wasn't the woman he thought he knew, or maybe it was, and he had simply chosen not to see her. The thought made his stomach tighten. At the office, his team was already gathering. Familiar faces, usually eager to please, now looked cautious. The head of finance spoke first. "Marcus, we've reviewed the freeze order. If it holds, we can't move funds, can't exec. Ute deals. Everything pauses. It won't hold," Marcus said sharply. "Find a way around it." The man hesitated. "If Mrs. Hale's ownership claims are validated, she has authority we can't override." Authority. The word echoed like an insult. Marcus slammed his hand on the table. "She doesn't even work here." "She might now," someone muttered, barely audible. Across town, Emily sat in a quiet cafe, untouched coffee cooling in front of her. She watched people pass by, ordinary lives moving forward, as if nothing monumental had happened. The woman in the black suit sat across from her, reviewing notes. "Marcus will escalate," she said. "Expect public pressure. He'll try to control the narrative." Emily nodded. "He always does." "Are you ready for that?" Emily thought of years spent shrinking herself to keep peace. "I've been ready longer than I realized." By evening, headlines began to circulate. Speculation, half-truths, whispers of betrayal. Marcus leaned into it, feeding selected details to friendly outlets. He painted himself as blindsided, deceived. A husband betrayed by a wife who hid her wealth. The sympathy he sought began to flicker online. Emily watched the coverage quietly. She didn't react. Instead, she called her attorney. "File the disclosures," she said. "All of them. That will expose everything," he warned. "Yes," Emily replied. "That's the point." The next morning, the shift was undeniable. Documents surfaced. Timelines clarified. The story Marcus tried to sell unraveled under the weight of evidence. Trust structures, signatures, emails proving notification. Each revelation chipped away at his credibility. Marcus sat alone in his office, watching the news turn against him. His phone buzzed constantly, allies growing scarce. He realized too late that the woman he mocked had not only prepared for this moment, but had chosen patience over spectacle. And patience, he was learning, was far more dangerous. Marcus did not sleep that night. He lay awake in the penthouse he still called his, staring at the ceiling as if answers might be written there. Every sound felt louder, every shadow heavier. By morning, his confidence had hardened into something sharper and more dangerous. If Emily wanted a fight, he would give her one. He had spent his entire career overpowering obstacles. He would not start losing now. He arrived at the office before anyone else, suit pressed, expression controlled. The boardroom felt different without the usual energy, as though the walls themselves sensed the shift. When his legal team joined him, their faces confirmed what he already suspected. "We're running out of room," his attorney said carefully. "If we keep pushing this angle, discovery will open doors we can't close." Marcus leaned forward. "Then we don't play defense," he replied. "We go public." By noon, he was seated across from a well-known business journalist, carefully framed as calm and wounded. He spoke about trust, about betrayal, about how success made him a target. He implied manipulation without saying it outright, letting viewers draw their own conclusions. The interview aired that evening, and within hours, social media buzzed. Some sympathized, others questioned. Marcus focused only on the noise. Noise meant relevance. Emily watched the interview from her office, the space newly assigned to her. The title on the door still felt surreal. She didn't flinch at his words. Instead, she reached for a folder marked with dates and names she knew by heart. "It's time," she said to the woman in the black suit. "You're sure?" "Yes. He wants a story. Let's give him the truth." 2 days later, the deposition was scheduled. Cameras were allowed. "Transparency," Marcus had demanded. "Transparency," Emily accepted. When Marcus entered the room, he wore the expression of a man convinced he could charm his way out of anything. Emily sat opposite him, composed, unreadable. The questioning began simply enough, routine confirmations and timelines. Marcus answered smoothly, confidence returning with each sentence. He painted himself as careful, diligent, honest. Then Emily's attorney slid a small device across the table. "Do you recognize this?" Marcus frowned. "No." "It's a recording," the attorney said. "From your phone." The audio played. Marcus's voice filled the room, laughing, dismissive, cruel. He spoke about hiding assets, about controlling Emily, about how easy it was to keep her in the dark. The room froze. The confidence drained from his face in real time. "That's not real," he said weakly. "It's authenticated," the attorney replied. "Multiple times." Emily spoke then, her voice steady but firm. "You didn't just underestimate me," she said. "You documented your contempt." Marcus looked around, searching for support. There was none. The cameras captured everything. Within hours, the clip spread everywhere. The narrative collapsed. Sponsors distanced themselves. Partners called meetings. The board convened without Marcus. By evening, he was informed of an emergency vote. Removal pending investigation. Marcus sat alone in his office as security waited outside. The world he built was dismantling itself piece by piece, not with rage but with precision. He thought of the courtroom, of Emily standing quietly, of the moment he laughed. The memory burned. When the vote concluded, the result was unanimous. Marcus Hale was no longer CEO. Emily stood at the window of her new office, watching the city lights come on. She felt no triumph, only clarity. This was not revenge, it was reckoning. She had not destroyed him overnight. She had simply stopped protecting him. Marcus was escorted out of the building just after sunset. There were no cameras waiting this time, no dramatic confrontation in the lobby, just 2 security officers walking slightly behind him, close enough to be unmistakable. His access card had stopped working an hour earlier. His office had already been sealed. The company he CE referred to as an extension of himself, now treated him like a liability to be contained. Outside, the city air felt colder than he remembered. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, unsure of where to go. For years, every step of his life had been scheduled, accounted for, managed by assistants and drivers. Now there was no one. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts, pausing on names that once answered immediately. One by one, he stopped himself from calling. Pride still lingered, stubborn and bruised. Across town, Emily attended her first executive briefing. The room was filled with people who had once ignored her presence completely. Now they listened. She spoke calmly, outlining next steps, stabilizing plans, legal timelines. There was no bitterness in her tone, no urgency beyond what the situation required. She wasn't performing. She was simply doing the work she had quietly prepared for over years. When the meeting ended, one of the senior board members approached her. "You handled this with restraint," he said. "Many wouldn't have." Emily offered a small smile. "I didn't want chaos," she replied. "I wanted clarity." He nodded. "You got both." That night, Marcus returned to the penthouse only to find another surprise waiting. A formal notice lay on the counter, stamped and official. Temporary residency review. Asset occupancy pending final determination. The space no longer felt like a home. It felt borrowed. He sank onto the couch, the weight of the day pressing down hard. He turned on the television, hoping for distraction, and found himself instead. His face filled the screen. Headlines scrolled beneath it. Former CEO removed amid financial misconduct investigation. Audio recording sparks backlash. Public reaction was swift and unforgiving. The comments were worse. Strangers dissected his character, his words, his arrogance. The image he had so carefully constructed was unraveling in public. Emily watched none of it. She spent the evening reviewing reports, organizing documents, preparing for the next legal step. When she finally shut her laptop, the silence felt different than it used to. It wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. She realized then how much noise she had lived with for years, constantly accommodating someone else's ego. The next morning brought another shift. Marcus's accounts were limited, certain privileges revoked. Advisors stopped returning calls. The walls closed in slowly, deliberately. He told himself it was temporary, that he would recover, that he always did. But the pattern felt different. This wasn't a setback, it was exposure. Emily met with investigators that afternoon. She answered questions directly, providing documentation without hesitation. Transparency, she knew, was her strongest position. The investigators listened, asked follow-ups, took notes. When they left, one of them paused. "You could have hidden a lot of this," he said. Emily met his gaze. "I spent too long hiding already." By the end of the week, Marcus understood the full scope of what he was facing. Not just a divorce, not just a loss of position, but accountability, the kind he had avoided by staying just ahead of consequences. He sat alone at a small desk, reviewing legal notices that felt endless. Each page confirmed what he feared. Control was no longer his default state. Emily stood once again in a courtroom, this time not as a silent figure, but as a recognized authority. The judge addressed her directly, acknowledging her role, her cooperation, her standing. Marcus watched from the other side, quieter now, smaller. He didn't interrupt, he didn't mock, he barely spoke. When the session ended, Emily gathered her things and paused briefly. She looked at Marcus, really looked at him, and felt no satisfaction, only finality. She nodded once, a polite gesture, and walked away. Marcus remained seated, staring at the empty space she left behind. For the first time, he understood the true cost of underestimating someone who chose patience over power. He had mocked her silence, believing it meant she had nothing to say. He never imagined it meant she was waiting. The legal pressure intensified quickly after that. What Marcus had once dismissed as procedural noise became a relentless presence in his life. Subpoenas arrived with alarming regularity, each one more specific than the last. Financial records, emails, internal communications he barely remembered sending were now being examined line by line. The investigators were thorough, methodical, immune to charm or intimidation. For the first time, Marcus felt what it was like to be on the other side of scrutiny. He hired new lawyers, more aggressive ones, convinced that force could still bend the situation in his favor. They spoke in closed rooms, voices low, strategies whispered as if secrecy itself could reverse reality. "We can slow this down," one of them assured him. "Challenge jurisdiction, question intent." Marcus nodded, clinging to the idea that delay equaled control. But even as they spoke, the world outside those rooms kept moving. Emily's days followed a different rhythm now. She arrived early, left late, and filled the hours in between with decisions that mattered. The company stabilized under her direction. Projects Marcus had ignored were reassessed. Deals that once favored speed over ethics were paused, restructured, or cancelled outright. Employees noticed the difference almost immediately. Meetings were quieter, more focused. There was less fear, more clarity. One afternoon, Emily stood before the board again, this time to present a long-term plan. She spoke about sustainability, transparency, accountability, not as buzzwords but as foundations. The board listened intently. Some of them had built their careers under Marcus's leadership and were now forced to confront how much they had tolerated. Emily did not shame them. She simply offered a different way forward. Meanwhile, Marcus's public image continued to erode. The recording from the deposition resurfaced again and again, clipped and reshared, analyzed by commentators who dissected every inflection of his voice. Sponsors withdrew quietly at first, then openly. Invitations stopped coming. The circles he once dominated closed ranks without him. He told himself it was temporary, that the world was fickle, but the isolation felt permanent. Late one evening, Marcus sat alone at a small kitchen table in a rented apartment. The penthouse was gone now, reassigned pending final judgments. The new place was functional, impersonal. He stared at a stack of papers spread before him, numbers blurring together. He had built his identity on expansion, on growth, on being ahead. Now every calculation pointed backward, toward loss. Across the city, Emily received a call she had expected, but still found heavy. The lead investigator informed her that formal charges were likely. "Your cooperation has been noted," he said. "It made a difference." Emily thanked him and ended the call, sitting quietly for a moment afterward. She did not celebrate. She knew what came next would be harder. Accountability, even when justified, carried weight. Marcus received the same news differently. His lawyer delivered it with rehearsed calm. "They're moving forward," he said. "This will go to court." Marcus felt something inside him collapse, not loudly but completely. He had imagined negotiations, settlements, compromises. He had not imagined this level of finality. As weeks passed, the contrast between them sharpened. Emily's presence grew steadier, more assured. Marcus's world shrank. Friends he reached out to responded with careful distance. Some didn't respond at all. He began to understand that power was not just money or position, it was trust, and he had spent it recklessly. On the day formal charges were announced, Marcus watched the press conference from his apartment. His name scrolled across the screen, paired with words he never believed would apply to him. Fraud, misrepresentation, breach of fiduciary duty. Each term stripped another layer from the persona he had crafted. He turned off the television, the silence roaring in his ears. Emily stood in her office window again, the city stretching endlessly below. She thought about the woman she had been at the beginning of this process, sitting quietly in court, underestimated and dismissed. She thought about how easily Marcus had mocked her, how confidently he had assumed she would fold. The memory no longer hurt. It felt distant, like a story she once heard about someone else. She knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be appeals, scrutiny, difficult decisions. But for the first time, she felt aligned with herself. No more shrinking, no more explaining her worth to someone determined not to see it. Marcus, alone with his thoughts, finally admitted what he had avoided since the courtroom doors first opened. He hadn't just lost control. He had lost the narrative, and no amount of anger or denial could rewrite the truth now unfolding, step by deliberate step. The trial began on a grey Monday morning, the kind that pressed down on the city and made everything feel heavier than it already was. Marcus arrived early, dressed carefully, his expression neutral but tight. The courtroom was larger this time, the stakes higher, the audience broader. Reporters filled the back rows, pens poised, eyes alert. This was no longer just a divorce fallout or a corporate dispute. This was accountability in public view. Emily entered a few minutes later, composed, her posture relaxed but deliberate. She acknowledged no one as she took her seat. To Marcus, the difference between them felt painfully obvious. Once, he had been the one people watched. Now, attention followed her. Not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it. The prosecution laid out its case with precision. They spoke of patterns, not accidents, of decisions repeated too consistently to be dismissed as mistakes. Emails were displayed, timelines reconstructed. The recording resurfaced again, this time contextualized within months of financial maneuvering. Marcus listened, jaw clenched, each piece confirming what he could no longer deny. His arrogance had left a trail. His defense tried to counter with complexity, arguing misunderstanding, miscommunication, pressure. They framed him as overwhelmed, overextended, a man crushed by expectations. The argument might have worked once. Now it felt thin. The evidence was too clear, too thorough. Emily testified midway through the proceedings. She did not dramatize. She did not embellish. She answered questions directly, explaining how she had discovered inconsistencies, how she had tried to address them privately, how she had been dismissed each time. Her restraint made her words heavier. The courtroom listened in silence. When Marcus took the stand, the contrast was sharp. His answers were careful, measured, but defensive. He deflected responsibility, reframed intent. Under cross-examination, cracks appeared. Small inconsistencies grew larger. The prosecutor waited patiently, letting Marcus talk himself into corners he didn't see until it was too late. Outside the courtroom, public opinion shifted decisively. Commentary turned from speculation to analysis. Experts weighed in, pointing out the patterns Marcus claimed didn't exist. His supporters dwindled. His critics grew louder. He tried not to look, but the reality followed him everywhere. Emily returned to work each day between sessions. The company continued moving forward, unaffected by the noise. Decisions were made, plans executed. Stability returned where chaos had once been normalized. Employees spoke quietly about the change, about how different leadership felt when fear was no longer a management tool. As the trial progressed, Marcus's isolation deepened. His lawyers spoke to him in increasingly frank terms. We need to prepare for outcomes, one said. Marcus nodded, though his mind resisted the words. Outcomes had always been something he dictated, not endured. The closing arguments came faster than he expected. The prosecutor spoke of trust broken not once but repeatedly, of power abused behind closed doors, of the cost of arrogance. The defense responded with appeals to doubt, to mercy. The judge listened, expression unreadable. When the verdict was announced, the room held its breath, guilty on multiple counts. The words landed with finality. Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. He did not react outwardly. He simply sat, staring ahead as if the world had gone slightly out of focus. Emily closed her eyes briefly, not in relief but in acknowledgement. This was not vindication. It was consequence. As the court adjourned, Marcus was led away, his future suddenly narrow and defined. Emily remained seated for a moment longer, gathering herself. When she stood, she did so with quiet strength. She walked out of the courtroom into a world that no longer questioned her place in it. Sentencing was scheduled weeks later, but for Marcus, time lost its meaning almost immediately after the verdict. Days blurred together in a haze of meetings, paperwork, and long silences. The man who once thrived on momentum now lived in pauses. He was no longer making decisions, he was reacting to them. Every conversation carried an undertone of inevitability, as if everyone already knew the ending and was simply waiting for him to teach up. Emily, meanwhile, experienced a different kind of waiting. She continued working, not as a distraction, but as a declaration. The company had stabilized, but she pushed further, implementing reforms that had once been dismissed as unnecessary. Ethics committees were formalized. Oversight increased. Transparency became policy, not promise. She knew critics were watching closely, waiting for missteps. She welcomed it. Accountability, she had learned, was not a threat, it was a shield. When the day of sentencing arrived, the courtroom felt colder than before. Marcus stood again before the judge, thinner now, his posture less assured. The arrogance that once defined him had faded into something brittle. He listened as the charges were summarized, the impact outlined, the damage measured not just in money, but in trust. His lawyer spoke briefly, requesting leniency, citing stress, ambition gone unchecked. The words felt hollow. Emily sat quietly in the gallery. She did not avoid looking at Marcus, nor did she fixate on him. She watched with the detachment of someone who had already processed the loss long before it became public. When the judge addressed her briefly, acknowledging her cooperation and restraint, she nodded once, nothing more. The sentence was firm. Significant prison time, restitution, restrictions that would follow Marcus long after release. The gavel came down, sharp and final. Marcus closed his eyes. For a moment he looked smaller than ever. A man reduced to consequences. As he was led away, he turned instinctively toward Emily. Their eyes met. He seemed to search for something. Anger, regret, forgiveness. Emily offered none of it. She simply held his gaze, steady and neutral, then looked away. That was the hardest part for him. Not the punishment, but the absence of reaction. Life adjusted quickly afterward. News cycles moved on. Marcus became a cautionary tale, his name referenced in articles about corporate overreach and unchecked ego. Emily's name appeared too, but in a different context. Leadership, reform, a case study in quiet resilience. Months passed. Emily settled fully into her role, no longer defined by what she had endured, but by what she built. The company expanded thoughtfully, avoiding the reckless pace that had once been celebrated. Employees noticed, so did investors. Stability proved more attractive than spectacle. One evening, Emily walked through the office after hours, lights dimmed, the city glowing outside. She paused at the window, reflecting not on Marcus, but on herself, on how close she had come to believing the small version of the story he told her, on how silence had once been a survival tactic, not a weakness. Marcus, in his new reality, had ample time to think. Stripped of distractions, he replayed moments he once dismissed, conversations he ignored, warnings he laughed off. He finally understood what Emily had meant when she spoke about seeing what others missed. The realization me too late to change anything, but it changed him nonetheless. Emily never visited him. She did not need closure from him. Her life was full, demanding, forward-moving. She had reclaimed more than assets or titles. She had reclaimed her sense of self, independent of anyone else's approval. The story, as the public remembered it, was about downfall and justice. The truth was quieter. It was about what happens when someone mistakes silence for absence, patience for weakness. It was about how power shifts not with noise, but with preparation. The world Marcus entered after sentencing was smaller, slower, and unforgiving in ways he had never imagined. The routines were rigid, the days repetitive. Time no longer bent around his needs. It passed evenly, indifferently. In the absence of influence and distraction, he was left with memory. And memory, he discovered, was relentless. He replayed moments he once considered insignificant. Emily sitting quietly at the dining table while he talked over her. Emily asking careful questions he brushed aside. Emily reading documents while he assumed she was only pretending to understand. Each recollection sharpened the same truth. He had not been deceived. He had chosen not to see. Outside those walls, Emily's life expanded. She was invited to speak at conferences, not about Marcus, but about governance, resilience, and leadership under pressure. She spoke plainly, avoiding drama, focusing instead on systems and accountability. People listened. Ined. Her credibility came not from what she survived, but from how she moved forward. The company entered new markets with caution and clarity. Decisions were slower, more deliberate. Profits grew steadily, without the volatility that once defined success. Emily built a leadership team that valued dissent and dialogue. The culture shifted from fear to responsibility. It was not flashy. It was sustainable. Marcus followed fragments of this through limited channels, headlines glimpsed, conversations overheard. Each mention of Emily's success carried a sting, not of jealousy, but of recognition. She had not needed him to thrive. He had needed her to remain unseen. Years passed. Marcus aged quietly, the sharp edges of his ambition worn down by routine. He read more. He listened more. He learned, too late, the difference between control and respect. Some nights he wondered what his life might have been if he had listened when it mattered. The thought lingered, unresolved. Emily rarely thought of him anymore. Her days were full, her focus outward. She mentored young leaders, particularly women who reminded her of her earlier self. She encouraged them not to shrink, not to wait for permission. Preparation is power, she often said, and patience is not silence. On a clear spring morning, Emily stood at the opening of a new headquarters, sunlight reflecting off glass and steel. She addressed the crowd briefly, thanking her team, acknowledging the work ahead. There was no mention of the past. It no longer defined her. The story that began in a courtroom ended not with vengeance but with transformation. Marcus had mocked her during the divorce, confident in his dominance. He never imagined that her quiet strength, her hidden preparation, would dismantle everything he stood on. Not in anger, not in haste, but with precision. In the end, Emily did not destroy Marcus overnight. She simply stepped into the truth of who she had always been, and that was enough to change everything. Time moved forward, as it always does, indifferent to who keeps up and who falls behind. For Emily, the years following the trial were not defined by triumph, but by responsibility. Success did not feel like fireworks or applause. It felt like early mornings, long meetings, and decisions that carried weight beyond profit. She had stepped into leadership not to prove a point, but to build something that could last without her constant presence. The company became a reference point in its industry, often cited as an example of what careful governance and ethical oversight could achieve. Analysts spoke about its stability, about how it resisted the reckless cycles that destroyed competitors. Emily rarely commented publicly on her personal journey. When asked, she redirected conversations towards systems, teams, and long-term vision. She understood something Marcus never had. Narratives are fragile, but structures endure. At home, her life was quieter. She lived in a space chosen for comfort rather than status. Mornings were slow when they could be, evenings often filled with books or conversations that did not revolve around work. The silence that once felt imposed now felt earned. She had learned the difference between being alone and being isolated. Occasionally, someone would bring up Marcus, usually in passing, an article, a statistic, a reminder of what happens when power is left unchecked. Emily acknowledged these moments without attachment. She did not correct people or add details. The story no longer belonged to her. She had moved on. Marcus's world, by contrast, remained narrow. Release came eventually, but freedom felt conditional, constrained by supervision and limits that followed him like a shadow. The world he returned to was unfamiliar. Technology had advanced. Faces had changed. His name carried a history he could not escape. Opportunities were scarce and trust scarcer still. He took work where he could find it, far from the boardrooms and stages he once dominated. The anonymity was jarring at first, then strangely grounding. For the first time in his life, no one expected him to lead, no one deferred. He existed without an audience. In quieter moments, Marcus thought about Emily, not with bitterness, but with a sense of unresolved understanding. He finally recognized the pattern that had governed his life. He equated control with value, dominance with worth. He had mistaken silence for emptiness and patience for passivity. The realization did not redeem him, but it softened something rigid inside. Years later, their paths crossed once more, briefly, at a professional event neither had planned to attend. There was no confrontation, no drama, just a moment of recognition across a crowded room. Emily nodded politely. Marcus returned the gesture. That was all. The chapter closed without ceremony. For those who followed the story from the beginning, the ending felt understated. There was no final speech, no public reckoning beyond what had already occurred. But for Emily, that was the point. Power, she had learned, did not need an audience. It needed intention. She returned home that evening and stood by the window, watching the city settle into night. Lights flickered on, one by one, each representing a life moving forward in its own direction. She felt no need to look back. The woman who had once been mocked during a divorce had not risen to destroy. She had risen to become whole. And that, in the end, was the quiet truth behind the spectacle. Not revenge, not humiliation, but the undeniable force of someone stepping fully into themselves, long after others stopped paying attention. The final chapter unfolded without headlines or cameras, the way most real endings do. There was no dramatic announcement, no sweeping declaration that marked the moment everything truly settled. Instead, it came quietly, through routine, through consistency, through the slow realization that the past no longer held any power over the present. Emily's days were full, but balanced. She divided her time between strategy meetings and mentorship, between oversight and trust. She no longer felt the need to prove herself in every room. Her authority was established, not through force but through reliability. People knew what to expect from her, and that predictability became a source of strength. She had learned that leadership was not about being the loudest voice, but about creating space where others could speak without fear. One afternoon, she received a letter forwarded from a legal office. It was brief, procedural, informing her that the last outstanding matter connected to Marcus had been resolved. No action required, no response needed. She read it once, then placed it in a drawer she rarely opened. There was no emotion attached to it anymore. It was simply information, detached from memory. Marcus, in his quieter life, found himself thinking less about what he had and more about what he had misunderstood. He volunteered occasionally, not out of obligation, but because it filled the long hours with something resembling purpose. He listened more than he spoke. People who met him now would never guess the scale of the world he once occupied, and that anonymity, once unbearable, had become his teacher. He understood now that Emily had never hidden herself out of deceit. She had hidden because she was testing a question he never thought to ask: who would see her if she offered nothing but herself? He had failed that test not because he was cruel, but because he was incurious. He had been too consumed by his own reflection to notice the depth standing beside him. Emily, on a rare quiet weekend, visited a small coastal town where the air smelled of salt and the pace of life slowed naturally. She walked along the shore alone, shoes in hand, waves brushing her feet. She thought about how close she had come to believing the version of herself that had been imposed on her, how easily she could have accepted it and lived smaller. The thought no longer frightened her. It strengthened her resolve. She did not regret her marriage. It had taught her patience, discernment, and the value of preparation, but she did not romanticize it either. Some chapters exist only to shape what comes next. They are not meant to be revisited. The story, when retold by others, often focused on the shock, the secret identity, the overnight collapse, the dramatic reversal. But those who looked closely could see the truth beneath the spectacle. Nothing about Emily's rise was sudden. It was the result of years spent observing, learning, choosing restraint over reaction. Marcus had mocked her during the divorce because he believed power announced itself loudly. He never imagined it could wait quietly. In the end, there was no single moment where justice felt complete. There were many small ones instead. A meeting that ran smoothly, a decision made without fear, a night of uninterrupted sleep. These were the victories that mattered. Emily returned from the shore as the sun dipped low, the sky painted in soft colors. She felt grounded, certain, unburdened. The life ahead of her was not defined by what she had escaped, but by what she had chosen to build. And somewhere in a much smaller world than before, Marcus continued forward too, carrying lessons that arrived too late to save him, but not too late to change him. The quiet ones, Emily knew now, were never powerless. They were simply waiting for the moment when being seen no longer mattered.